All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking way past the iceberg to unpack the hidden realities of the Titanic's final 160 minutes. We all know the basic, legendary story, right? An unsinkable ship goes down on its maiden voyage. But we're going to examine the precise, fatal decisions, the ignored warnings, and the systemic flaws that transformed an absolute engineering marvel into a man-made tragedy of priority and class.
I want us to really ask ourselves what actually occurred in those chaotic moments. We're going to focus on the untold micronarratives and the systemic failures that the history books often gloss over. Because, it wasn't just a sudden, unavoidable sinking. It was a massive domino effect of human choices and, frankly, fatal hubris. By looking closely at the data and the timelines, we can break down exactly how this disaster unfolded. Okay, so it begins at 11:39 p.m. Picture this. You're out in a freezing ocean with absolutely zero moonlight. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spot this massive dark shadow looming in front of them. That led to the frantic, terrifying phone call to the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. Now, prior to this exact moment, the ship's radio room had actually received ice warnings from at least 7 different ships. 7. Yet the Titanic was still pushing an incredibly dangerous 22.5 knots. And the reason? Well, White Star Line's owner, J. Bruce Ismay, was on board, and he wanted to make headlines by rolling into New York ahead of schedule. Now, think about this incredibly short window of time. Just 2 hours and 40 minutes. That is all it took for a $7.5 million unsinkable ship to completely vanish beneath the waves. From the literal second of impact, a relentless clock was ticking. But the sheer, massive scale of the disaster was vastly underestimated by almost everyone on board for the first half of the night. And here is where the absolute impossibility of the situation becomes terrifyingly clear. 37 seconds. That's all they had. Just 37 agonizing seconds to try and alter the course of an 882-foot-long ship moving at 22.5 knots. First Officer William Murdoch ordered a hard starboard turn and full reverse. But physics simply wouldn't allow it. The ice scraped the side. And it was actually a bump so minor to some passengers that they literally played with the ice that fell onto the deck before just going back to sleep. So let's track how that initial indifference quickly morphed into a rapid cascade of failures. By 11:50 p.m., literally just 10 minutes after the strike, Captain Smith and the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, went deep below decks to see what was up, and what they found instantly drained the color from the captain's face. Things were moving incredibly fast. By 12:05 a.m., the order was given to start uncovering the lifeboats. The engineering reality down in the dark was just brutal. You see, the ship was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 flooded compartments. 4 was the magic number. But the Iceberg had sliced open 5. They were rapidly filling up with freezing water. Andrews quietly did the math in his head and delivered the staggering blow to Captain Smith. A sinking within 1 to 2 hours was now mathematically inevitable. The ship was doomed, and they were among the very few people on board who actually knew it yet. Then comes the fatal math of the lifeboats, and this is a massive systemic oversight. Even if filled to absolute perfection, there was never enough room for more than half the people on board. Let that sink in. 2,224 souls on the Titanic, but only 1,178 seats in the boats. The plan, if you can call it that, was for the boats to act as ferries to a rescue ship, not as a floating refuge for everyone at the exact same time. That one decision would soon cost hundreds of lives. To make matters so much worse, a false sense of security and incredibly unclear orders meant those early boats left tragically empty. Take Lifeboat 1, for example. It had room for 65 people. But it was lowered into that freezing, pitch-black ocean with only 27 people aboard. Passengers were just hesitating. They didn't want to leave the bright, seemingly safe, giant ship for a tiny wooden boat. Plus, the crew had no clear, forceful orders to pack those boats to capacity. While those half-empty boats are being lowered, history's biggest what-if is unfolding right nearby. The SS Californian was sitting a frustratingly close 18 to 20 miles away. That is close enough to have potentially saved 1,500 lives. But their radio operator had gone to sleep for the night. Even more tragic, the officers on the Californian's deck clearly saw the bright white distress rockets the Titanic was firing into the night sky, and they took absolutely no action to investigate or go help. Now, breaking down the survival rates exposes a really deadly class divide and deep systemic injustice.
While stewards were actively guiding upper-class passengers up to the boat deck, third-class families literally found themselves stopped at locked gates, trapped in this confusing maze of lower corridors. The stark, undeniable result? A 60% survival rate for first class, but only a 25% survival rate for third class. It's the exact same sinking ship on the exact same night, but with drastically different outcomes depending entirely on your ticket. It is a bitter, bitter paradox that White Star Line owner J. Bruce Ismay, the very guy who pushed for dangerous speeds just to make headlines, secured himself a seat in a lifeboat, while the working class paid the ultimate price. A staggering 80% of the men in third class perished that night. They were trapped below or freezing in the water, while the architect of the ship's reckless pace managed to just row away safely. Fast forward to 1:20 a.m., and the situation is just utter chaos. As the bow went under and the deck tilted violently, survivors described hearing this horrifying, deafening noise. They said it sounded like a massive structure just collapsing in on itself. Everything inside that wasn't bolted down was crashing forward. The rear of the massive ship slowly began lifting completely out of the water, pointing straight up toward the dark sky. But, despite the overwhelming panic, we see these contrasting human behaviors of extreme, unbelievable heroism. Crew members actively chose to sacrifice themselves. Wallace Hartley and his band kept playing music on the slanting deck, finishing with Nearer My God to Thee, just to try and soothe the panic. Radio operator Jack Phillips refused to leave his post, sending out desperate SOS messages to the very end. And deep, deep below, the engineers stayed down in the dark, keeping the generators running so the ship would stay lit for as long as humanly possible. When the ship finally broke in two and plunged beneath the surface at 2:28 a.m., passengers were thrown into -2 degrees Celsius water. That gave them a terrifyingly short survival window of just 15 to 30 minutes. Those who were sitting safely in the lifeboats were forced to just listen to the agonizing sounds of thousands of people crying out in the pitch black, knowing the freezing temperatures were rapidly taking their toll. Now, Lifeboat 14 bravely rowed back into the dark to search the freezing waters, pulling a few from the sea. But almost all the other boats, they stayed away. They were absolutely terrified of being capsized by the desperate crowds in the water, so they just sat there in the silence with empty seats. And strictly because of that fear, 1,502 people died that night before the rescue ship, the RMS Carpathia, finally arrived at 4 a.m. to pull the remaining 710 survivors to safety. If you go down 3,800 meters deep today, you'll find pairs of leather shoes remaining completely intact in the abyssal depths. They serve as haunting, permanent markers of the individual dreams and lives lost. Because tanned leather doesn't degrade in that specific deep-sea environment, those shoes lie exactly where their owners fell. Each pair represents a real person who boarded with hopes, dreams, and a destination they never, ever reached. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. When extreme hubris meets unforgiving nature, who ultimately pays the price? Was this just an unavoidable, tragic accident? Or was it a completely preventable disaster driven by wealth, systemic inequality, and the fatal arrogance of ignoring the warning signs? It's a lot to think about. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the stories we think we know.